Characterization Continuum, The Giver. To review, characterization is the name for the techniques the writer uses to reveal the personality of character reader. Characterization is achieved in a number of different ways. We often speak of character traits as absolutes. That is, characters either have them or they don't. So we might describe a character as thoughtful and gentle. That's useful for a start. But even a character that we recognize as thoughtful and gentle in general can be more or less gentle and more or less thoughtful, depending on the situation. Considering the variations in character traits can be the first step in taking a more realistic view of the complex thing we call character. We can consider character traits as existing on a continuum, a scale with opposite traits at the ends and a whole range of possible points in between. For example, think about the giver. He's presented initially as a man who is in control not only of himself, but of the responsibility of knowledge and the repository of knowledge for the community. He controls not only the memories of the community, but also their transmission. Now, look back at pages 105 and 106, where the giver is unable to work with Jonas. He is overwhelmed by the memories and knowledge and pain that burden him. You can see that the giver's trait of being in control is responsive to circumstances, meaning that it changes based on the circumstances that the character finds himself in. So to say that the giver is or isn't self-controlled would not come near to telling the whole story. For each of these character continuums, we can come up with examples of behavior on either ends or in the middle. For example, at the beginning of the story and throughout many points in the story, Jonas behaves in ways that could be characterized as gullible. But at other points in the story, he acts more insightful. There are also points in the story where Jonas behaves in a way that's very honest, but in other circumstances, he might behave in ways that are deceptive or even deceitful. In certain circumstances, Jonas behaves as a follower. He's dependent on others. But when circumstances change, he becomes a leader and he begins to think, act, and feel more independently. Your task is going to be to write a description of how Jonas's behaviors vary along one of these continuums or another that you identify. If you choose a continuum that's not shown here, please speak with me so that we can go over it to make sure that there are enough examples. Before you get started, I'd like to give you some description starters. So if you choose to write about how Jonas acts along the gullible to insightful continuum, you might begin by saying, at the beginning of the story, Jonas behaved in ways that would characterize him as gullible. As the story continued, his behavior changed and he became more insightful. For example, and then you would give examples of how he's gullible, examples of how he's insightful, and examples that come somewhere in between. If you chose the honest to deceptive continuum, you would discuss how Jonas behaves in ways that are honest and deceptive. You might start off by saying something like, Jonas can be both honest and deceptive. This depends on the circumstances he finds himself in. For example, the last continuum that you could choose, if you want to use one of the ones I've given you, is the follower/dependent to leader/independent. You could begin by saying, Jonas can be a follower and dependent on others. He can also be a leader and act and think independently. This depends on the circumstances he finds himself in. For example, and then, as I stated with the previous two continuums, you would give examples of how he's a follower and dependent, examples of when he behaves as a leader and behaves independently, and then examples in between.